Thank you for joining us, everybody. I'm Carolyn Simard, and I'm here with my colleague, Melissa Abad. And what we want to share with you today is kind of a summary overview of our work on intersectional leadership. So we convened a corporate program meeting last October 4th, and companies really exchanged frameworks and practices to how to do diversity and inclusion with a more intersectional lens, recognizing that not all diversity dimensions are being acknowledged in the current conversation. So the agenda for today is we're going to start with kind of a research overview of what intersectionality is and what questions can it inform us answering in our D&I practice. And then in the second half, I'm going to be sharing the actionable takeaways on strategies on how to approach this discussion within your organization. Whether you're a D&I expert or you're an ERG member or you're just an individual who wants to help move the conversation forward. So first, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Melissa Abad, who's research associate here at the Center for the Advancement of Women's Leadership. And Melissa was the thought leader behind the content we presented in October and is leading our work in this domain. And she's going to take us through the research framework. There you go, Melissa.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction, and good morning to everyone. As Carolyn said, I'm going to be giving the research overview, and that will involve two parts. One, where are we now currently when we think about women of color in leadership? And two, how can we learn from the literature on the concept of intersectionality and put it to work in our diversity and inclusion practices? So first, we thought we'd give you a snapshot of what it actually looks like, where the numbers are. As you can see, most leadership positions are held by either white men, and then coming in second are white women. But important data to see here is there's one Asian woman, Fortune 500 CEO. There's one Latina Fortune 500 CEO, and there are 0 Black women, Fortune 500 CEOs. And we share this to illustrate how dire the situation is, right? And to really point out, more importantly, that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. And so it's not just the numbers that show this, but researchers have demonstrated this. So in 2016, there's an HBR article that looked at the language and diversity approaches, right? And what they did is analyzed language that highlighted difference as an asset versus equality as an asset. And so here are some examples of what was said. So for the difference side, things like we recognize that everyone benefits from the knowledge and experience of diverse cultures, right? We actively promote diverse culture through our recruitment, versus equality that says things like all persons without regard to differences among them shall be respected and valued. And what they found was that the language was correlated with different outcomes for different groups. More specifically, what they found was that language that highlighted difference tended to show increases for white women's leadership, and language that emphasized equality was more positively correlated with the progress of Black men and women. And so we share this to say that right now where the language stands, we have to think about what groups are benefiting and which ones aren't, and how we can shift the conversation so that more groups are benefiting from diversity and inclusion practices. And what we're arguing today, and what we argued at the corporate meeting, was that it's really thinking about the term intersectionality. Right, and so before we get there, I'm going to highlight that one size does not fit all, but organizational practices haven't adjusted. And two, diversity and inclusion leaders, employee resource group leaders, and individuals are looking for insights to begin addressing this challenge. And also taking into account that the political landscape we're in right now is pretty rocky, to say the least. And so how do we address these challenges in a climate that is already polarized? And so what we did before we did the corporate meeting was we sent out a survey to our corporate partners and to see what practices people are engaging in, what works and what doesn't. Really, the original goal was to put everyone on an equal playing field, and then also to have corporate partners be aware of what other organizations are doing. And we found a couple of things. One, the majority of companies look at representation data for gender, race, age, and veteran status. Two, a much lower proportion have collected data on sexual orientation, ability status, and national origin. And thinking about the workforce composition in tech, these are important categories to think about. And especially since my time here in the Silicon Valley, I just think, for example, national origin and ability status have come up a lot in conversations. Third, about half of our corporate program members consider the intersection of gender and race. And then in terms of programming, a majority of companies have implemented affinity groups as well as networking events. Less common are groups to engage allies. And by allies, we mean alliances within gender groups and across gender groups, right? So how do we are engaging white men and women when it comes to questions about the intersection of race and gender? Also less common are mentoring and sponsorship groups and targeting and hiring and onboarding programs, right? The programs that do exist are generally not designed to address overlapping dimensions of diversity. And what we're hoping to do with our research is to fill that gap. So companies, right, are still limited in the diversity dimensions that they do check. There are legal and resource constraints to collecting multiple diversity dimensions across geographies, right? We do realize that many of you have locations not only throughout the US, but throughout the world, which makes it difficult to understand how do you measure diversity. And then significant investment in programming, accountability systems, and change management, but not with the overlap of multiple dimensions in mind. And the last takeaway really is the experience of women of color is overlooked. So questions are, where do we start and where do we stop? So like I said earlier, this concept of intersectionality, which has become a buzzword recently in the tech industry, provides a useful lens to begin addressing these challenges. So right now I'm gonna define the concept, talk about its themes, talk about its tenets, and then after wrapping that conversation up, I'll turn it over back to Carolyn. So first, the definition. It's an analytic framework that really captures a larger intellectual project of Black feminism, but Kimberly Crenshaw coined it in the late 80s to attend to the unique position of Black women in civil rights law. The term posits that multiple dimensions of identity come together to create unique discrimination and oppression dynamics and experiences. But as I hinted earlier, right, it's not just gender and race, there's other things to consider, right? So when Crenshaw came up with the term in the late 80s, the figure on the top left-hand corner illustrates sort of where she was, and then the second image, right, really exemplifies where intersectionality is in contemporary society, right? We're talking about age, gender, race, national origin, ability, geographic region, and the list goes on, right? So the question is, how do we deal with all these multiple intersections in our diversity and inclusion programming? So Stacy Blake Beard reviewed key tenets. 1, human lives cannot be explained by examining single categories. Our lives are multidimensional and complex. 2, people can experience privilege and oppression simultaneously, depending on the situation or context. And during the CP meeting, she did a really good exercise with our attendees, where attendees got to think about and reflect on how they experience both privilege and oppression in different contexts. 3rd, we need a degree of reflexivity when taking an intersectional approach, right? How do we become aware of our power, privilege, and position, and the extent to which we sustain and or challenge the existing status quo? And lastly, intersectionality is explicitly oriented towards transformation, building coalitions among different groups, and working towards social justice. So again, when we think about intersectionality, it's not just looking at the intersection, but what we're looking at the intersection accomplish, because it's that takeaway that really is important when using an intersectional lens in diversity and inclusion programming. And she took that from this pamphlet, which will be featured at the end of the talk, called Intersectionality 101. And so the key themes in intersectional research that we went over. So first, like Stacy mentioned, multidimensional identities, this question of visibility, who's visible at work, whose work is visible at work, and why. 3rd, knowledge and work. So whose knowledge is being valued, whose knowledge is being celebrated, right? And how does that link to their career trajectories and the outcomes of the organization? 4th, resource allocation. What kinds of resources are being put into programming for different populations in the organization? And lastly, this question of belonging. To what extent are all staff, all employees feeling like they are a valued contributor to the organization and the organization's outcome? Okay, so the question is how do we put all of these things into what's been researched when it comes to diversity management, right? And so what I found in reviewing previous research is a few things. In terms of what matters, it's a system of accountability. Who is responsible for enforcing these programmings? Or the metrics that you decide to measure? Third, it's a combination of programming. It's not just an employee resource group. It's having the employee resource group with a diversity officer or a task force where the full-time job is to create and sustain the programming. How are these employees interacting with managers becomes another piece of what matters when it comes to diversity management, right? It's not just the job of HR to enforce these the metrics. It's also incorporating it throughout the entire organizational culture. And lastly, job ladder transparency. That is, when employees know how to climb up within the organization, the outcomes across groups tend to be positive. In terms of what's missing, what are the contemporary goals of current employees? Third, how is programming created, right? So a lot of the research focuses on how federal policy forces organizations to enact diversity programming, but the question is, what are other maybe more effective or more grassroots programming, and how do they compare to the programming that's enforced by federal compliance? Third, what's the criteria for leadership, right? Not all employees want to reach the C-suite, and how do you celebrate the different kinds of leadership that exists within your organization and value the work that the diversity of employees offers? Again, blocking bias across multiple dimensions, right? We've done claims and a lot of work when it comes to gender, but how do we expand our model to include these multiple dimensions? Redesigning work and quality of life. We shared a research study that looked at the goals of contemporary women of color and found that, family, for example, it's not just someone's spouse or someone's children, but it's their extended network. And how do you design questions when it comes to work-life balance to these changing definitions of family? And lastly, and most importantly for us, is what kind of diversity management programs are actually informed by intersectionality? Because what we found so far is none are yet, and how do we create that programming, which I think creates a really unique opportunity with our corporate program to really not only fill this research gap, but also fill this practice gap. Mm-hmm. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So Melissa provided a great overview of kind of the initial research framework that informs the intersectional lens, if you will. And the goal here is to provide everyone with kind of a new way of looking at this and kind of begin the conversation. So this is an area where we know there's not enough research that's been done, and there's also not enough practice that's been done. So then the question is, how do you leverage this lens to inform practice at this point in time? And what I'm going to do with you is share the key strategies that practitioners shared at the meeting. So beginning to apply this concept into practice. And I apologize if you hear a dog growling in the background. That's my dog. My apologies for that. So how do we begin to implement this new framework in our diversity and inclusion work, right? And so we've had the benefit from hearing from a lot of you and a lot of thought leaders on what may work here. So the first step and the first strategy is to diagnose. And by diagnose, we mean make the invisible visible. So often what happens when you start talking about overlapping diversity dimensions, such as women of color or the interaction between sexual orientation and age and gender, is that the numbers become very small, right? So it becomes much easier to kind of dismiss the experience of people who sit at the intersections of multiple diversity dimensions, because everybody's kind of dismissing it, saying, oh, the numbers are so small, we don't know if this is generalizable, right? We don't know what this means. So the reality is, when you're dealing with very small numbers, you have to dig deeper. You have to think about what are the most relevant intersecting dimensions of diversity in our workplace, right? Where are these dimensions in our workplace? Which ones are the most relevant? What is the experience here? And what we heard from practitioners is that this requires thoughtful conversation because you want to do justice to the dimensions of difference that are within your organization, but you also don't want to create false equivalencies, right? You want to recognize who's experiencing more systematic barriers versus who is experiencing an exclusion, and it's a relevant diversity dimension to consider, but recognize that the specific dynamics may be different, right? So one example that's come up from practitioners, for example, is looking, for example, at the experience of women of color, and then there's another conversation going on about extroverts versus introverts. Now, it's important to acknowledge that introverts may be feeling excluded, but it's also important to recognize that historically women of color have experienced very systemic barriers and discrimination. So really understanding and not creating false equivalencies is key. Starting with questions really enables the organization to make the invisible visible, right? So who is being overlooked? Who is not having equal access to opportunity? Where is this happening in the organization? And so what practitioners recommend is starting with a full data diagnosis that goes beyond the more general race only, gender only, age only kind of snapshots that practitioners often work with. Now, we understand that the data is inconsistently tracked depending on the organization's composition, right? So the quantitative data at the different stage of the employee life cycle may give you with some indices, but you may also need to really go deep and collect stories from people. And so storytelling has come up resoundingly in this conversation as a critical tool in diagnosis. And from our original work on bias, we emphasized the role of storytelling to kind of highlight where exactly people are experiencing bias in the organization. So this very similar approach really enables organizations to make the invisible visible. Storytelling enables people to go beyond the problems of the small representation statistics, right? So where people may be able to dismiss, oh, well, look, we only have 10 African-American women in the organization. So if we're more able to dismiss that the numbers are small, actually their stories will not easily be dismissed because stories really generate empathy and really engages others in understanding the very specific experiences of employees. It can refine our understanding and really highlight the very subtle ways in which differences are being experienced. And the other thing it does is that it engages allies and organizational actors. So how do you go about collecting these stories? Well, we've heard from several practitioners about conducting focus groups, conducting individual interviews, really reaching out to their ERGs as a critical area of the opportunity of sharing stories to inform the organizational strategy, right? And we've had really incredible examples too of entire campaigns in organizations where people are invited to share their story. And then on the new data frontier, some practitioners also shared some new approaches to data collection that can also make the invisible visible. For example, one company discussed how they want to go and map influence networks and really understand how different dimensions of diversity affects the kind of networks and resources people are having access to in the organization, which actually can diagnose really precisely who is being overlooked and who is being left out. So that's really promising kind of new data being experimented with from some of our partners. Stacy Blake Beard made a very, very critical point, which is if you're going to do a D&I strategy with an intersectional approach, it's not quick, it's not easy, and it's not cheap. And often we want the quick fix solution or the quick program that we can roll out to show that we're moving in the right direction. but a lot of thought leaders and practitioners really urged everybody to take their time in doing this work and going deeper to really get the full nuance and the value of the different voices that really need to inform this work. So we also discussed overcoming very challenging dynamics in having these conversations that are sitting at the different dimensions of diversity. And so right now we're in a very, very polarized environment. And I'll talk some more about that, about how companies are kind of managing this very difficult dynamics of intense activism and backlash simultaneously in their organization. And so some very difficult conversations need to happen, and practitioners are trying to create as safe spaces as possible to generate the conversations about gender, about race, about discrimination, right? And about multiple experiences in the workplace of inclusion and exclusion. So Stacy Blake Beard has done a lot of work on mentoring across differences, and what are some of the challenges in having kind of conversations across multiple dimensions of difference. And there are two very clear dynamics to put on the table here, and you need to be aware that these dynamics will happen when you start fostering this conversation, and actually naming them can really help people feel more comfortable, right? So one is protective hesitation. Protective hesitation is essentially one person being afraid of providing their opinion because they're afraid of offending the other person, right? So let's say I'm a white woman and I want to be an ally and I'm having a conversation with a woman of color. And now let's say I'm afraid that I'm going to say something that's not going to be received well. Maybe I'm going to say the wrong thing. And since right now the conversation on social media is very, very active, maybe I'm even more reluctant because now I'm afraid that if I say the wrong thing, not only will I offend my colleague, but maybe as well, I'm going to create some sort of backlash for the entire company, right? So protective hesitation is a dynamic, right? And maybe I'm afraid of being called racist, and so now I'm withholding even more, and I'm just having a shield in my ability to contribute to the conversation and be a true ally, right? And learn. Now, the other dynamic is the flip side of the coin. It's called protective defensiveness, right? Which is somebody who's experienced discrimination dynamics may come to the conversation very reluctant to share because quite frankly, it hasn't felt safe before to share, and they've been attacked and they've been made to feel devalued. And they're feeling kind of tired of the emotional labor involved of always being the one expected to educate others, right? And so by recognizing that we need to both be aware of these dynamics, and that depending on the context, right, you'll experience one or the other. And engaging people in agreeing on key norms to have the conversation, right? To say, okay, we recognize these dynamics, but in this conversation, we want to try to move past them, and creating that safety for people to really share their experiences with an open mind. So these are two great dynamics to keep in mind in fostering these conversations. Second strategy is to look to the past of your organization, learning from the past to inform the future. So Ella Bell Smith, who was our keynote speaker at the corporate program meeting, she's from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth and is one of the foremost scholars on documenting the experience of Black women in corporate America. And she says that in her research, what she's found is everybody always thinks that the first woman of color is the first one, right? The woman right now is the first one. And often when she looks back at the history of the organization, what she realizes is that there have been women of color in leadership in the past. And the problem is we forget and we fail to really update our current strategy to the lessons we should have been learning in the past. So to her, one of the best places to start is to revisit company history and to see what has worked and not worked in the past for minority employees and factoring these lessons into future plans, right? So really approaching this as implementing a culture of continuous learning and improvement. So depending on how young or more mature your company is, you may have some more or less digging to do, but asking the questions about who came here before me, whose shoulders am I standing on, right? What can we learn from our past as well as inform our future? Strategy 4, which is really related to this concept of storytelling, is educating. Not only creating the safe spaces for those conversations to occur, but also educating. And we heard a lot from practitioners about the benefits and pitfalls, for example, of unconscious bias training, and when does it work, and should we give it up, and when does it not work? And what the research shows is that education is a necessary but not sufficient condition for change. And in this conversation around race, gender, age, and overlapping diversity dimensions, it's even more important to have a key piece around education. The key here is to, first of all, view it as a key important part of the set of programming that Melissa talked about to continue driving change, but without having a compliance mindset, right? And without rushing to expect quick fixes out of the program, which is view it again as an ongoing conversation that can also couple education with key process changes, right? So if you only go to process change to block bias without the education, then people don't understand what they're trying to fix for. But if you only do the education without the actual process change to block bias, then people don't know how to implement their learning into their actual decision making, right? And then tying it to accountability mechanisms and peer accountability to reinforce this culture of continuous improvement. The other thing that we heard loud and clear during the meeting is that there's been a lot of focus on educating managers, but we need to make sure leaders are also a part of this conversation, and the experts that are in the human resources, right? So department, which is often we actually forget to include them in this training, and since they own people processes, they're actually extremely important as potential change agents. The next strategy we heard about at the meeting is experimenting with new governance models. And so some companies are re-looking at their D&I governance model thinking, okay, so in the past, we were pretty clear on what our governance model was. We were going to goal people and have metrics on gender, on race, on abilities, on veteran status, but we assumed these were different silos. And so our governance structures was actually not set up to look at overlapping diversity dimensions simultaneously. So what we heard is that there's early experiments happening from practitioners to try to adapt the governance model to be more intersectional, depending on the dimensions they're really trying to grapple with in their workplace. So a couple of approaches that we heard about at the meeting. One is that creating kind of cross-ERG leadership education and sharing, and really fostering a lot more bridges between representatives and leaders in the employee resource groups and affinity groups to really act as catalysts for this more intersectional conversation, and make sure that then they can keep cross-pollinating this lens with the participants in their affinity groups, right? So finding a lot more opportunities for these different groups to work together, which also helps counter kind of the misperception that these efforts are somehow divisive, right? That if we're focusing on one, we're not focusing on the other, and it's a zero-sum game. Really engaging employee resource groups in some joint efforts and programmings really accelerates the momentum of the change. The second approach we heard about is the creation of inclusion councils that would kind of bring different perspectives at the table, again, drawing from different elements of the employee population, and make them work on the problem together, again, to bridge multiple diversity dimensions in the designation of the programming. Another promising approach that we heard about, it's to start with organizational values. So one company that presented their results talked about that they didn't start reprogramming, they didn't start with a lot of activity. What they started with is looking at their organizational values. And then what they did is engage the leadership in being on board with adding a value to their very, very serious organizational values that they hold themselves accountable for every day. And then what they did is they added inclusion to their values. And so that can provide a unifying umbrella, right, under which these overlapping dimensions of difference can actually come together and have the difficult conversation. So we don't know how we're going to address all these dimensions of diversity and make sure everybody feels included, but we know since our core value is inclusion, we have to continue this conversation, right? And this is the broader long-term mission that we're working on. So it could provide kind of an alignment among different groups to start working on this together. It also ensures that the effort isn't seen as a check the box, a quick fix, or like, here's now we did intersectionality this month and we're done kind of thing, but it's a permanent state of continuous improvement, right? Even as it goes way beyond the US, right? It unifies the entire organization globally, which is then we can continue this work knowing that it's not going to be done and that it's a state of continuous improvement. The other strategy we heard about is really rethinking allyship, right? So first of all, in the data that Melissa presented, very, very few of our corporate members have specific ally initiatives, right? So forums for allies to engage and really discuss how to be a great ally are still not widely implemented. And in thinking allyship, what we heard from practitioners is often being extremely strategic in which stakeholders are uniquely situated to be very effective allies, right? And that they have a unique set of influence in the organization, regardless of their positional authority. So that can be your leadership, but it can also be very influential members of the affinity groups, influential managers, important voices in the organization, and they can be uniquely situated to accelerate change. In trying to engage allies and understand how do we develop allyship, what we talked about with a lot of practitioners is often when we think about, oh, how am I going to convince everybody to get on board with being more supportive and acknowledging different diversity dimensions and accelerating progress, often what happens is you have some people who are very, very resistant to change, and they're very vocal about it, right? And we call this that it's 10 to 20%. Right, about. And often these voices are really disruptive and they're very loud. And what we end up doing is focusing all of our attention on trying to convince those people who are most resistant to change to get on board. But the reality is we're actually never going to convince them, right? They're just not on board at all. And so while we're investing our resources in convincing the naysayers, we may actually lose on the opportunity to engage the 80% who were perfectly willing to become allies and really want to learn about how to move this work forward, right? So we talked about our tendency in general to overinvest on the super negative voices and losing momentum on the 80% who want to engage. So in thinking about developing allies, realizing that there's a lot of people who are kind of in the middle, who are willing to get on board, and that we can target them first and really increase the pace of change. The other point that was made is that the composition of ally groups is changing. So we often think of developing allies, we often think of white men, as the most important. Somehow I like to engage, and the reality is the workplace is extremely diverse. And so you can engage allies across multiple diversity dimensions, and that should be incorporated in one's diversity strategy. It's not just about engaging white men as allies. So for example, one of the points that was repeated over and over again at the meeting is that we need better tools to engage white women to become better allies for women of color. And that one of the key themes of the meeting was that that conversation has really failed to galvanize, and that white women have not been particularly effective allies on behalf of women of color in accelerating change for all women. And so that becomes a critical conversation that can happen in real ways when we think about what does it mean to be an ally. Another strategy, and it's almost like a survival strategy, it's anticipate and plan for backlash. And so what we heard about from a lot of our practitioners, and this includes, you know, whether you're the head of the D&I initiative, or you're a manager of a team, or you're an ERG participant, or you're just an individual who cares in general about these issues, is that the velocity of backlash right now is extremely challenging to keep up with. And there's increased activism in the workplace happening in a lot of external events. So you have internal events happening, external events happening, and a lot of push and pull with people who are frustrated with the lack of change and also feel very hurt and unsafe by all of the events that are happening. And then on the flip side, the backlash from people who are feeling very, very resistant to this change. And so what we heard from practitioners is increasingly they're trying to develop an approach as part of their strategy to crisis management, right? They see that their leaders are being called on to comment on events such as the Charlottesville protests, the Google memo, or different things that are happening in the ecosystem, if you will, right? And now they feel like every week there's some crisis to respond to, and they need to think about how do we have this conversation. And so some effective ways that practitioners started to share best practice around is to first kind of putting this crisis management team in place, which includes corporate communications, internal D&I leaders, executive sponsors, and kind of define a process for responding to these events. And in order to determine what to respond to, some people suggested going back to the organization's values and the stated principles of the D&I strategy, kind of as a first point of guideline about, does this make sense? Should we jump and respond to this, or should we hold back in this specific case, right? What makes sense here? And it is also useful to think back to the composition of your workforce, right? Who in our workforce is likely to be very affected by these events? How is this impacting the belonging of my employees right now? Are they feeling unsafe in their ability to even be a part of this society and as a result, this organization, right? So really thinking through how it affects your employees. And once you do the diagnostic works and the story sharing to make the invisible visible, you become much more able to understand how to respond and what to respond to. Aligning the executive team on their criteria for responding can be really useful, and really engaging them in conversation about the criteria and what makes most sense. And then engaging executives in scenario planning. So one practitioner shared how they engage in scenario planning, such as what would we do if we had the instance, for example, with the Google memo here? What would be our response? How would we tackle it, right? What would we do if X happened? What would we do if Y happened, right? So really engaging people in scenario planning to start unpacking really the specific situations that may arise, but also create a roadmap so that then people don't feel like they're in reactive mode all the time. And finally, we heard from practitioners about experiments to train managers and leaders to facilitate critical conversations within their teams, right? So knowing that when these very threatening events happen, it's going to affect employees, and really trying to equip managers to have those conversations. Often people actually feel safer sharing in smaller groups if the manager is equipped with the right facilitation tools. That can be effective. But of course, this is baby steps, right? Because this is a difficult skill to learn. Okay, the 7th takeaway is perhaps what I consider the most important of all, which is to really measure success in small wins. And so we've talked at length about the small wins approach to ongoing organizational change in this space. And so we need to understand that moving overall representation numbers with an intersectional lens is a long-term and deep commitment, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't tackle it, right? So often people are tempted to kind of throw their hands like, oh my God, there's 0 women, Black women CEOs, will never get there, I can't do anything, right? So that's kind of a boil the ocean kind of response, like when the problem feels so big that I don't know where to begin and I'm just gonna give up, right? And there's kind of a lot of that. It's very dangerous feeling in this space right now, right? And research shows that if a problem is framed as too big, you can't get people to move, right? That's one of the tensions with problems like climate change, for example, right? It feels so big, what can I possibly do? So we need to reframe and really give people the ability to recognize small wins. And so this doesn't mean a short-term quick fix approach. Actually, that doesn't work either, and we've seen that in the data. And so celebrating actual small wins and rethinking about our metrics of success and being really informed but also creative with them, right? So for example, if there's been a very difficult conversation that's happened and we were able to move past protective hesitation and protective defensiveness, that's a win, right, in this conversation. That's really something to celebrate. If we convened an event where seemingly very different groups with very different interests and experience learned from each other and were kind of galvanized to be better allies to each other, that's a win. Other leaders have shared with me that, you know, an email from their CEO addressing a current event, they said like they want to frame this and put it on their wall because they never thought they would hear their CEO take such a strong stand on behalf of gender and racial equality and diversity and inclusion. That's a win. And so being really able to reemphasize and celebrate those wins also encourages people to keep going. Because now I'm like, okay, so I did one good thing, I can do it again. And it really can really energize people to really become better change agents on behalf of this issue. So now we're going to move to the Q&A. And thank you so much for sharing your questions. And the deck will be available to everybody, so you feel free to use this in your work and repurpose it for your specific organizational context. And so I'm going to just look at the questions here. Great, thank you. Too often, senior leaders look outside their own organization to fill spots. What can be done to impress upon leaders the importance of grooming and development from within? Is there research and translation data out there on this? So this is a great question, because often when we want to so-called get more diversity or fix the problem, often people will say, oh, okay, I'm gonna hire somebody from outside, and then that's going to generate more diversity, right? What research shows actually is the opposite, is organizations that have more of a focus on developing talent from within with the long-term view are much more successful in their diversity efforts overall, right? And that shouldn't be surprising because it's, at the end of the day, this is about providing opportunity and access to people for the long term. What I would love to see personally is this to become kind of a industry-wide field view, right? That if we all promote talent, yes, some will leave, but that will benefit others. And another organization does a great job of grooming theirs, and this person gets a job with me, then all boats are going to rise. So I think that's a great focus. And I think that's a key conversation. And often if we're only focused on the short-term metric of moving representation numbers, we forget to say, like, actually, if we do invest in talent development, it may take a little longer, but would then have a culture where people get the kind of access to opportunities and advancement. That's what ultimately we're after. Thank you. Storytelling, how do you leverage this focus on storytelling when there's only one of you in the organization? Melissa, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think there's a couple things. One, the first thing that comes to mind is that's extra work if you're the only one. And so an employee has to think about, what do I hope to gain by sharing my story of difference, right? And difference, I'm being inclusive when I think about difference. And so that's the first question. The other thing that question makes me think about is, how can you bring other stories to your organization? One of the things that came up in our kitchen cabinet meetings this summer, when we met with a handful of diversity and inclusion officers from different corporate partners, what we found is that concern was, when we were thinking about women of color, is we don't have enough at one organization, right? And so that was one of the things that inspired us to launch this project on the career trajectories of women of color in corporate America, with a specific focus on tech and finance. And I was able to share some of the stories of my respondents at the CP meeting, right? And so one of the goals at the end of this project is to repackage these stories, right, to make them accessible to different corporate partners, so that so it's not just one person telling his or her story or their story to their organization, but really just creating a narrative to talk about difference, where it takes the onus off the employee and puts it really just on the industry in general.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Melissa. Another one which is related to this is, how can we encourage women of color to support other women of color? What works? To me, it goes back with making the invisible visible. And we saw a beginning of this conversation at our meeting, where Ascend came and shared data on the systemic underrepresentation of Asian women in leadership positions in technology. And that kind of began a conversation, because we had experts who had been doing a lot of research on the experience of Black women who said, wow, I had no idea. I was buying into this myth of Asians as the successful minority. I didn't know, right? And so beginning those conversations about the experiences of various groups and really shining a light on them really helps people engage more effectively and really become better allies towards each other. The other one is managers of strong performers may be resistant to developing people to move upward and out, right? So managers can be hogging great talent. And again, how do we develop a culture where we encourage managers to promote others? What are some practices around this challenge, and what works? So one is back to what Melissa was sharing with the research, is to be as transparent as possible about what it takes to advance in the organization. Now, of course, some organizations are earlier and they don't have like a full job ladder and levels and this and that and criteria and this and that and the other, but it may be a good conversation to begin to really have people talk about, so what is your experience with advancing in this organization? What does that look like? Is it meritocratic? Is there a network effect of people promoting people they know and they're more comfortable with versus who is being left out of this access? And then I've seen companies actually who are more mature in kind of developing this kind of internal bench. I've seen them establish kind of norms that you actually have to put up your top talent for internal promotions, and kind of take the amount of managerial discretion out of the equation, so that managers then can't just keep the talent for themselves. That may or may not work within the framework of your culture. However, really celebrating the managers who do it well and who promote others is extremely important. The problem often is that the people who do this well get absolutely no recognition for it, and they just kind of get dinged because now they lost a good performer. So being able to really celebrate and reward that in managers is really important. We try to celebrate it at Stanford when people join other departments and get a promotion. We try to really celebrate that for ourselves. Leaders promote from within those employees who reflect their beliefs and their norms for leadership. How do we get leaders to be more flexible in their definitions of what makes a leader? So one of the most pervasive barriers to the advancement of diversity is what we call narrow definitions of leadership. And in our research, we've observed, not only we coded performance reviews and saw how people's accomplishments were being talked about, but we've also observed talent reviews and calibration meetings where people talk about who should be promoted, who did a good job, and who do we think as having kind of the high potential versus the qualifications for leadership. And what we found is that even when the criteria for leadership are very thoughtful and really create a wide range of behaviors, in the heat of the conversation, people revert back to very, very narrow definitions of leadership, right? Which often is perfectly aligned with kind of a white male stereotype. So what we saw in our research is that women were being dinged, women of color were being dinged, men of color were getting dinged. And so all the ways in which they weren't stereotypically fitting this very narrow definition of how leaders are supposed to look like and behave like. And so this really requires going back to a deep conversation around criteria, which is, how do we define leadership in this organization, starting from skills and measurable metrics as much as possible? How do we make sure that the criteria are not being narrowly interpreted, and really showing the patterns to the leaders of what's happening here, right? So if you have a very elite group of high potential, for example, if you see the patterns of the demographics and start diagnosing, how is it that we're ending with this very homogeneous population in this top talent category, then there's something we need to go investigate and diagnose. So really engage the leaders in diagnosing what's going on. And because they often really believe in meritocracy, once they see that what's happening underneath is not actually in keeping with the ideals of meritocracy, they become really engaged in finding solutions. There's another question on equity versus equality. And I'm going to have Melissa take that. Do you want to repeat the question before?
So the question is increasing focus on equity versus equality. The person states, when leaders focus on equality, employees may receive benefits who don't need them. While we focus on equity, some groups receive more benefits than others. What are our thoughts? And I think it builds on some of the themes you were just discussing in terms of criteria. I think equity and equality, the comparison and each word becomes a slippery slope. So it's really a question of criteria and transparency, right? One of the things I've been learning since I've gotten here are a couple of things. One, some groups get more resources than others, right? So the question is, how do you disperse these resources to other groups? The other piece I'm learning is that, right, how much are employees taking into account what their employees need, right? So the interviews I've been conducting for the last few months, what struck me is the extent to which employees don't know how to ascend within their organization. So the question is, how do we make that information more accessible so that employees can take ownership of how they move through the organization, right? Because I think when we think about equity versus equality, it really just becomes a question of information and access, and the extent to which employees have have exposure to what it actually looks like to climb in the organization, right? And how they can map their careers within the organization to benefit not only themselves, but the organization itself. Because I think one of the things that's missing from this conversation about equity versus equality is when employees have access to a transparent job ladder that helps them navigate their organization, it's in everyone's best interest. Some people get more access to that through informal networks, informal relationships, right? Going back to the point from earlier, leaders promote people who reflect their beliefs and norms, right? So there's all these informal processes that expose employees to what it takes to get there when the job ladder isn't transparent enough. So it really is up to the organization itself to make these processes transparent, and also employees to ask their employers to make leadership trajectories a little bit more transparent so that more groups have access to this.
That's a great comment. And it's making the processes more transparent and also diagnosing how they're being used, right? Is there bias creeping into them, so that even though what we have on paper seems really fair, the way it's being implemented actually is riddled with problems, right? And so I think that's a really important point. And to me, the other key point on this is, which I love about this paper from HBR, is messaging matters, right? And we often think about our diversity programs or our mission. We often think about it almost like we want it to sound great and to inspire people, but we often think of it much more as an internal and external PR kind of thing, which is how is it going to be received, but we don't think about how is this going to actually affect the experience of belonging of the specific people this is meant to support. Right? And so I would love to see a lot more experiments and research on this topic, which how we frame things based on different contexts and what kind of impact does it have on different groups of employees, and how does it then engage people to be a part of certain aspects of change and not others, right? So which ones kind of fail to engage the broadest potential of change agents?
We do have a few more questions.
Okay.
Many of the women ERGs look to engage men, but found few become allies for women of color. Are there best practices that you have seen where women ERGs are driving the intersectionality within their ERGs and programs that have made an impact?
So how do we get more intersectional lenses from women ERGs? And we actually have talked to a lot of women of color, right? That they almost have to decide which hat they're wearing. If they're at the women's ERG, they're a woman. And if they're at the Black ERG, they're a person of color. But there's actually very few forums for them to bring both these perspectives together. And so in terms of having leaders more engage with women of color, I think it would be a very fruitful conversation to convene a very specific group at the intersection of these dimensions and encourage the storytelling that we talked about. Melissa, do you want to add something?
I think the other piece I would add, again, I should have mentioned, I've been in Silicon Valley for almost 10 months, and so I'm new to the space and new to tech, or understanding tech. But I've gone to many events and I participate in a lot of conversations. And one of the things I've observed is that this conversation around allies tends to focus between men and women. And one of the things I've seen missing in a lot of the events I've attended over the last almost year is conversations between the women who are running the ERGs and women of color. Because the diversity in these spaces just, I'm not sure where it is or how to promote it, but I feel like the first conversation women ERGs, from my sort of limited experience, seem to have is how are we including the experiences of women of color in our programming and in our conversations. Mm-hmm. And once that is established, I think it could turn into a conversation about how do we engage men, but really how do we engage all women across the differences? Because I think that would be the strongest first step for a lot of these women ERGs.
That's a really good point. Starting with defining the audience you're needing to reach, then worrying about how to expand from there. Yeah. That's really great. One question addressed, how do we do this in a global virtual workplace? And how do we even begin to have difficult conversations in that setting? And what we heard, I would go back here to the idea of small wins. What we did here in trying the challenges of trying to make this experience more global, we heard about specific experiments that companies are doing, which is, okay, one leader talked about they were celebrating Martin Luther King Day and invited international employees to participate and just engage and learn. And they found actually a lot of interest, overlap, sharing of different experiences, which for them was kind of a critical win to be able to have that conversation and begin the dialogue about how does race matter in your country? Here's our history. Here's what have you experienced? What's your experience being an employee in another geography, right? And what we have found in our research is that people who are in different geographies often experience these exclusion dynamics in a very real way. And so you have specific country-specific diversity dynamics happening, but you also have to recognize the power differential of being an employee in a remote location versus being an employee who has face-to-face access to leadership, right? So to me, that's another dimension of access and storytelling that needs to be shared, right? And really engaging people in a conversation on how do we engage our remote offices and our offices across the world in feeling more inclusion and belonging and making them a part of this conversation, I think is also very critical without them having a sense that, you know, all the practices are just being exported to every single geographies, but really engaging them and making the invisible visible there as well. So thank you so much. This is all the time we have, but we have, if we have other questions that are really salient, I would be happy to email answers to it. I really appreciate your engagement and participation in this conversation, and really welcome hearing your ongoing learnings and practices and what you've seen work. So if you have something you really want us to know about, please email us your ideas. We would really appreciate that. So a couple of upcoming events before we close. We have our Jing Lyman lecture featuring Carla Harris this Thursday, and she's going to share her career success strategies. And I highly encourage everyone to come to this incredible talk. She is absolutely phenomenal. And so please share the word within your organization. It's free and open to the public. And then on November 14th, we're going to have Zerlina Maxwell, who's Director of Progressive Programming and also was involved with the Hillary Clinton Progressive campaign. And she will talk about concrete solutions to tackle the issues around sexual harassment and sexual assault in our workplaces. So also a very timely and relevant topic. And our next corporate program meeting is in May, and we will soon announce our next round of webinars for 2018. Thank you so much, everybody, and really appreciate your participation. We have some resources on our member-only website on some of the research that we shared today, and also a lot of different research updates that we'll be sharing. And you all have access to this portal via your company's affiliation with us. And if you have questions about accessing those, please let us know. We'll send a recap of the webinar and a link to the recording and all of the content after we're done with this session.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.